The search is over. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back, or maybe I should say welcome into the Lane Lambert era of Seattle Kraken hockey, as they did yesterday, or probably 2 days ago as of when you're watching this, Thursday, hired the third head coach in Kraken history, and also third in the last 3 years, as Lane Lambert was given the position, which is part of the reason that I didn't ever bother doing a video talking about different coaches that they could go with. I mean, a lot of other people in the Kraken media space had already kind of covered that, and there's really no way to pin it down. There's a lot of rumors here and there of different guys, and I mean, based on the pool available, we knew there were some different options, but there were none that particularly stood out to me as someone the Kraken really had to go get, and I have to admit that Lambert wasn't even on my short list of ones that I expected. Well, at least not until we relatively recently heard that the Kraken had requested access to Lambert, or requested the Leafs give them a chance to talk to Lambert about their open position, and ultimately he is the guy that they go with. Now, there have been, again, rumors, and I don't think that the Kraken are trying to run away from them, so it is probably true that Lambert might not have been the first choice that they would have gone with, but some of the other guys, I mean, they were already pretty close to Mitch Love, it sounds like, and that one fell apart at the last second. So there's a couple of others that might have been higher up on their list that ended up going to other positions or just not working out for one reason or the other. But eventually it sounds like they're pretty happy, and you can see why with their selection of Lambert as the next head coach of the Kraken. Now I'll get into my more subjective thoughts, or at least some big pros and cons that I potentially see of this hiring here in a second. But let's start with the team themselves and Jason Botterill, the new GM, who made this hiring, where he said, after conducting an extensive search, we're thrilled to announce Lane as our new head coach. We cast a wide net of suitable candidates. What impressed us throughout the interview process was Lane's strategy and vision for this team. He was an integral part of the Capitals winning the Cup and the Islanders advancing to the Eastern Conference Final in back-to-back seasons, 2 straight Eastern Conference Finals. Again, something we know about this team is that they do value cups in the room. We see that throughout the roster construction, which I don't think that it really has too much to do with some of the issues with the roster construction. But, I mean, we've seen at points that they've had members of 9 straight cup winners on the roster. That's no longer the case with guys like Yanni Gourde leaving and all that. But it's certainly experience that they value, and they valued that experience in the coach as well. And then going on to say, we have full confidence in Lane to lead this team behind the bench. And then, of course, go on to say a few more things. They pointed out that they were definitely looking for a coach with some experience and not looking to take a guy from the college ranks or give somebody their first head coaching chance in the NHL at this point, which definitely points more in the direction that we already kind of knew, that especially the ownership, but even front office was headed in, that they want this team to be competitive as soon as possible and just aren't willing to take the risk on a first-time head coach in the NHL. Now, with that having been said, as far as Lambert's experience specifically as a head coach, it's not terribly expansive. After starting his coaching career in 2007 with the AHL's Milwaukee Admirals, where he spent a handful of seasons, he eventually moved up to an assistant role with the Nashville Predators. At the time, a note being made that part of his promotion to that role of assistant coach at the NHL level was how well he had done in helping the progression of a couple of the young star players of the Predators at the time, specifically Roman Josi and Pekka Rinne. And then eventually he would move to the Washington Capitals and be a part of that 2018 Cup winning team before moving with Barry Trotz to the New York Islanders, where he served as an assistant coach for a few seasons before eventually being promoted as the head coach after Trotz was fired. He spent 1 full season there as the head coach and then was fired halfway through his second season after 45 games, but did at least make the playoffs in both, well, made the playoffs in his 1 full season, and the team did eventually squeak into the playoffs the year that he was fired. And with that firing coming just about a year and a half ago, he spent this last season as an assistant coach with the Toronto Maple Leafs, where he was largely in charge of the defensive side of the game, where the Leafs did make some significant improvements, jumping from a below average to bad team defensively to one of the better defensive teams in the NHL, and it helped them get well, 2 more wins in the second round than they'd had in well over 2 decades. So I suppose that's better than nothing. As far as the head coaching experience specifically, in the full season that he spent with the Islanders in the 22-23 season, in the 82 games, the team went 42-31-9, finishing fourth in the Metropolitan with 39 points, and eventually would go on to lose in the first round in 6 games to the Carolina Hurricanes. And then the following year, he would eventually be fired after a 4-game losing streak that eventually saw the team at a 19-15-11 record. So lots of overtime lost points, especially in that first half of that season. Just 49 points, 45 games in, which, considering how the Kraken have gone the last couple of seasons, I mean, we would kind of take that kind of record. Now it does get you a little bit more into that just outside the playoffs, which is especially not where you want to be, but at least you're in contention and have a chance towards the end of the season, where that Islanders team eventually did make it into the playoffs, though they didn't even have the new coach bounce that you usually see. They were still kind of a bad team for a little while, went on a bit of a run, then had a losing streak, before eventually having a bit of a miraculous run towards the end of 2 seasons ago, where they picked up 17 of their last 18 points of the season, going 8-0-1 in their last 9 games to just squeak into a playoff spot before being quickly and decisively not swept aside, but losing in the first round once again to the Hurricanes in 5 games, with their only win coming in double overtime. So yeah, they still found their way into the playoffs, but the team wasn't much more successful without Lambert than they had been with him. And then, of course, as we know, this most recent season, the first full season without Lambert as the head coach or in the system at all for the first time in quite a few years, the Islanders had even less success than they had the previous few years, missing the playoffs for the first time in a while, or at least I should say less success up until the draft lottery, where against all odds they somehow ended up with the first overall pick, which is still a sore spot for the Kraken, who somehow dropped 2 spots from 6th to 8th with 2 teams jumping them. But that is a sore spot from a few weeks ago. Lambert now a part of the Kraken, coming over from the Leafs after leaving the Islanders. Either way, let's look into a little bit more, we're getting off the rails here, but look into more some of the team stats over not just the time that Lambert was the head coach, but the years previous when he was a big part of the team as an assistant head coach, and then the year following, just to give a little bit of context to Islanders as a team around the time he was a head coach. Now, the big thing that's going to stick out here, and a big part of the reason that he was the hiring for the Kraken, is, I think, the defensive side of the game. He is very much a defensive first head coach, which is something that we really have seen this franchise lean heavily towards under Ron Francis, and it doesn't seem that that's likely to change under Jason Botterill, at least not with this first move that he has made as GM, and that's not terribly surprising. Again, he was the AGM under Ron Francis, and Francis is still a part of the organization, even if he's not the one directly making the decisions yet. It's not terribly surprising that the defensive back-end forward mentality of the organization is starting to come through again after making a head coaching decision with Dan Bielsma that was a little bit more lean towards the offensive end. Lambert brings us back to more the Haxtell defensive first type of mindset, and you can see that really having paid off pretty well, not just with the Leafs this last year, but in his time with the Islanders, where in the 2 years leading up to him becoming the head coach, where he was still an assistant head coach and largely responsible for a lot of the defensive systems of the Islanders, they were among the best teams defensively in the NHL, giving up top 10 fewest goals against per game, GAA there, second fewest in 2021, 7th in 21-22, and then his year fully as the head coach, the orange line there, in 22-23, they were the 5th best team defensively when it comes to pucks actually ending up in the net. As far as shots, now some of this might have been because of Ilya Sorokin in net, who has been one of the better goaltenders in the NHL consistently over these last few seasons, and that is going to show up here in some of these stats, but we're kind of hoping that Decord is that for the Kraken, so hopefully the goaltending quality isn't changing too much from Sorokin in net for the Islanders at that point to Decord in net now for the Kraken. Of course, time will only tell. New systems can change some things, but strong goaltending is something that he had as a head coach and does show up a bit when you see the shots against average per game is still kind of middle of the pack. Expected goals against per game is slightly below average. And then when it comes to the high danger chances, they were one of the worst teams in the NHL at giving up high danger chances, which here is measured by shot location, a high danger chance counting for a shot from the slot or nearby area or off of a rebound. And so not necessarily a perfect stat, but clearly they were giving up more of those high danger chances than most other teams in the NHL per game. And then when it comes to that's the HDCA, there's high danger chance against, and then HDCO percentages, the percentage of those high danger chances that were converted, where again you see some of the goaltending sneak in, but maybe even some of the quality of those high danger chances, still even a high danger chance, not all are created equal. They were 9th best in the NHL at, even if they were giving up a fair amount of high danger chances, at least they were one of the best teams in the NHL at making sure that those still didn't end up in the net. Now, again, these are not perfect stats. Even the more advanced ones, like the high danger chances, again, are just based off shot location in this particular instance, and not at all accounting for what the defense looks like at the time the shot is taken. I mean, the rebound suggests that it's maybe not just off of a rush chance, but they could be either off of a rush chance or fully set up defensively. Either way, it's just where the shot is coming from, and this is an Islanders team under, well, really throughout the time that Lambert was there, and then even after he left, they still this last season were 18th, so below average, I guess a step up where they had been the previous few years, a fairly significant step up, but still not fantastic when it came to preventing high danger chances. Still, they have consistently been, and to be fair, even still consistently were one of the best teams in the NHL at preventing high danger chances after Lambert exited fourth this last season. And again, I think a lot of that can be attributed to Sorokin in net. But again, either way, whether it's a high danger chance or a low danger chance, at the end of the day, all that really matters is whether or not it ends up in the back of the net. And that all goes back to those goals against average, the average number of goals given up per game. And while Lambert was there as an assistant coach, 2nd, 7th, and then the season he was fully there as the head coach, 5th. And then as soon as he gets fired, they drop to 18th and then 20th this last season. So a pretty significant drop there after Lambert left the Islanders system. And as we know, again, this last season, the Leafs, who had a pretty significant history over this last season with the same core of players of not being a very good team defensively, but making up for it offensively back the other way. While they did take a step back offensively, Austin Matthews certainly didn't score as much as we've seen in previous seasons, and that was true throughout the rest of the team for the most part as well. But we did see that team play some of the most structured, well-structured defensive hockey that we've seen them play in quite a while, and we're a top 10 defensive team when it comes to the goals that they were giving up. And not all of that can be attributed to Lambert. Some of that is going to be the changes the Leafs made also at head coach over the course of the season, and some of the different decisions they made in net as well as defensive core. But again, as you can see, good defense seems to follow Lambert around at the NHL level. Of course, as we know, especially those of us that are familiar with Islanders hockey over the last 5, 6, 7 years under not only Lambert, but as well Trotz before him while Lambert was the assistant head coach, defense certainly isn't everything. And while it can get you to a couple of conference title appearances, they still end up losing both of those and don't advance to the Stanley Cup final. And it was kind of boring hockey to watch. And even outside of whether it's boring or not, I mean, getting to the conference final is something I think the Kraken would be more than happy with. But as we know specifically from years, especially 1 and 3 under Hackstall, defense isn't everything. And as far as the offensive side of things is concerned, well, you can see that they were very much focused on the defensive side, where the goals for per game for the Islanders were not as good, not only in the time that Trotz and Lambert were in the system, 21st and 22nd under Trotz with Lambert as the head coach, or assistant coach, sorry, and then 22nd and 22nd, the 2 years with Lambert, the full season head coach, and then half season head coach as well. Sure, they were starting to score more per game, but that was true across the league and stayed still in the bottom third of the league in goals for per game. Now, on the same note as we mentioned with the high danger chances, maybe pointing to some of that being good goaltending, they were potentially producing better than they were getting the output actually into the net, with the expected goals for being top 10 in 2021, and then still around average to slightly above average, 17th and 12th and 9th even, in the year that Lambert only spent half of the year with the team, and then 9th this last season. So maybe the Islanders are getting a little bit unlucky offensively, but it's still not a system, regardless, that seems to be producing very much as far as pucks actually getting into the net. And as far as high danger chances are concerned, it does seem like whatever changes Lambert made after Trotz left seemed to produce a few more high danger chances, as they went from 22nd to 20th in the last couple years under Trotz to all of a sudden going 6th in high danger chances the first year, the full year under Lambert, and then 9th the year that he left. But converting on those high danger chances was still an issue for an Islanders team that, outside of Matthew Barzal, really didn't have a lot of finishing power, which is certainly a criticism or worry that you could have about this Kraken roster, aside from the outlier season that was the year the Kraken made it to the playoffs, where they were able to convert on not only a ridiculous number of their high danger chances, but just a ridiculous number of the shots that they took in general. So assuming that's an outlier, the Kraken are another team that doesn't have a track record so far with their current roster construction of finishing at high percentage of their chances, whether high danger or not. So similar to the Islanders, they might not be scoring towards the top of the league under Lambert, similar to how the Islanders did. This is going to be a team likely under Lambert that's going to have to win from the back end forward. Now, I will say that one part of specifically the 22-23 Islanders under Lambert the full season that offensively does give me at least a little bit of hope that something might be better for the Kraken under Lambert than we've seen even this last season, but especially most of the time under Hackstall, was the heat map of where their shots were coming from, even if they weren't getting a ton of shots and weren't scoring a ton, even in spite of what we're going to see in this heat map. But the Islanders under Lambert, and this was true even to some degree under Trotz, and he spent a lot of time under Trotz, so it's not going to be terribly surprising that he might have a somewhat similar, at least heavily influenced by Trotz's coaching style, which has its pluses and minuses. But either way, the Islanders have been much better, or at least under Lambert and Trotz were much better at getting to the net and getting chances in and around the net, which the Kraken just have never been very good at. Certainly weren't the last couple of seasons, and even the year that they scored 4th best in the NHL and best at 5-on-5, they were not particularly good, or at least not drastically better than other teams in the league at getting those net front chances, which the Islanders under Lambert were much better at getting. Now, with that being said, the heat map does kind of point to, I think, more of what Hackstall was looking for, with taking shots from up by the blue line, up in the corners, from well out, and counting on traffic out in front of the net to get those rebound chances or get deflections. Not necessarily a type of hockey that this Kraken roster has ever been particularly good at, again, with a forward core that is on the smaller end, and generally speaking, group of guys that has not necessarily had a nose for the front of the net or getting into that rough stuff in the crease or out in the low slot. We'll see how much of that translates, but at least with the Islanders, he was pretty good at getting a team to commit to getting to the front of the net and getting those second or maybe even primary opportunities from some of those shots coming from well up at the point. Now, again, with a lot of shots coming up from the point, it might mean that we see a lot more of shots from Vince Dunn or Brandon Montour, defensemen that the Kraken have on their roster that do have a pretty good shot and can score from up there. But it would be nice if that wasn't the primary fuel for a Kraken offense. We saw that really didn't work very well under Hackstall, except for the outlier of that second season, where for whatever reason, it didn't seem to matter what they did, it just worked for them offensively. And just to round things out with the special teams, well, first off, the HDF percentage there, that's the high danger chances for and against, the percentage of high danger chances in a game that are for the Islanders. As you can see, the 1 year under Lambert, they actually did produce more high danger chances than they gave up, with 51.3% chances for. But aside from that, they were under 50%, which means there were more high danger chances coming against them in every other year that Lambert was, at least around that time. I mean, he was a part of their assistant coaching staff for a couple of years before what is shown here, but the couple of years leading up to it, and then the year where he was only there for part of it, are all still not great. And then this last season, they did improve back to 51.1, so it's hard to read too much into that. Whether, I mean, Lambert, they get back to the numbers that Lambert had as his first year as a head coach this most recent season, but it's still kind of league average even at that. So they're going to give up some chances and get them. It's not going to be terribly one-sided either way. But anyway, getting sidetracked there. As far as the special teams specifically, the power play and penalty kill, as you can see, if you were hoping for another new coaching change to revive, or not even revive, just get going for the first time ever this Kraken power play, I would not count on it. Not only because the Kraken, personnel-wise, just don't necessarily have the personnel to put out a top of the league or really anything below average power play, but Lambert has really never seen that much success under the power play. Now as an assistant coach, it's hard to say how much control he really had of the power play. Again, he's more defensive minded. So the 1 year that their power play actually was decent in 21-22, still under Trotz, the 22.12 for 12th best in the league power play. I don't know that we can attribute too much of that to Lambert, but it's hard to say without being in that coaching room. But then the year that he is the full head coach, and at least certainly has a strong voice on how the power play is run, they dropped to 30th before bouncing back to 19th the following year. But I mean, 15.77 is a pretty bad power play. Still, Islanders personnel wise are not a team that's likely to do well on the power play anyway, and we certainly saw that this most recent season after Lambert left, where they dropped to an even more abysmal 12.56 this last year, 31st best in the NHL. Penalty kill, though, that could be something that we do see a significant improvement for the Kraken, who have been anywhere from league average to worse, generally speaking, with the penalty kill. Under Lambert, though, this has been a team that's been pretty successful under the penalty kill, and we saw quite a drop-off after he was fired. Now, things weren't necessarily going particularly well midway through the season that he was fired, but with him as the defensive first assistant head coach, the penalty kill was 6th and 4th best in the 2 years leading him to getting the head coaching role, and then 9th best with an 82.19 penalty kill percentage in the year he was the head coach, before dropping to worst in the league at a 71.5 the year that he was fired midway through. And then they certainly didn't rebound very much this last season with a 72.22 for 31st in the league this last year. So I think there's reason to hope that he could bring a penalty kill system to the Kraken that could, at the very least, get them back to a league average to maybe even slightly above league average penalty kill. And at best, maybe they are a top 10 kill, and that certainly could help in a division that has a lot of offensive talent and a lot of young offensive talent on the rise, with especially what's going on with the Sharks, but even the Ducks have some of that as well. And of course, we all know what Edmonton has going on. Anyway, all that is to say, this is a different team in the Islanders that we're looking at these stats, and some of this is going to be the construction of that team versus the construction of the Kraken. That Islanders team under Trotz and Lambert was an older, more experienced team than what the Kraken have. So even the success that they saw in getting consistently to the playoffs, and even the couple of deep runs, or even the cup win that they had with the Capitals, is not necessarily something that we can expect from a less experienced, and certainly compared to that Capitals team that won the cup, less offensively talented team in the Kraken. But they are trends that have been consistent, whether he's been the assistant coach, the head coach for the year and a half with the Islanders, or even the assistant coach, defensively speaking, with the Leafs this last season. Defensive first mentality, and defensive first mentality that has produced some pretty good results in keeping the puck out of the net, has been consistent with Lambert throughout his time in the NHL in either an assistant head coach or head coaching role. And with a Kraken team that pretty unapologetically from Ron Francis has been built to be defense first, not only with the players that he picked from other teams in the expansion draft, talking about Francis, or the players that have been drafted and made it up to the NHL level. Obviously, Riker Evans, a defenseman, though an offensive first defenseman who didn't really finish the season well defensively, and we can get to that a little bit more as they still work on an extension for Evans. But specifically, guys like Matty Beniers, who they took second overall the first, and then eventually Shane Wright, who they took fourth overall a couple years later, are both forwards that, while specifically Wright does have a little bit more offensive upside, which we can get to some of the downside here in a second, but both of them are forwards that coming into their draft years were highly touted for their 200-foot game and capabilities defensively. Now for Wright, that hasn't quite yet translated to the NHL level. The defensive game is still something that he's trying to get caught up with. There's a couple moments, as we've talked about a couple of times towards the end of the season, where a couple moments per game he's going to have a rookie mistake and make a bad back check or a bad decision to pinch up at the wrong time, and sometimes that has cost the Kraken. But we know that he was getting better towards the end of the season, and certainly with Matty Beniers, this is the type of system that really could benefit him with the strong defensive game that he plays. And while we were kind of hoping that a more open up the ice north-south offensive game would spark him offensively under Bielsma, that never really happened. So playing to Beniers' strength in a defensive first system, while it might not improve his offensive numbers, certainly I would say it's going to be a long shot to expect Beniers to have a breakout offensively under Lambert. He is going to be able to excel under the better defensive structure. Even aside from the younger players, the rest of the roster is certainly, again, pretty unapologetically constructed defense first, and that certainly shows up with the amount of money that the Kraken are spending on the blue line and are just going to make that even more dramatic when they eventually do get an extension signed for Riker Evans. I don't expect that to be a particularly high AAV one, considering how Evans' season finished. I would expect probably more of a bridge deal there, though we said that with Beniers, and we saw how that turned out. So who knows, especially with it being the first offseason of Botterill making those signings versus Ron Francis. Either way, this is a team that is constructed to play the type of game that Lambert clearly tends to prefer. Just kind of, well, as we saw with the Islanders, sit around, don't make any mistakes of your own, and then jump on the mistakes that your opponent makes and turn those hopefully into high danger chances back the other way and find ways to score one, ideally 2 or 3 goals per game, and just count on the fact that your good defense and good goaltending, with whether it was Sorokin with the Islanders or Decord now with the Kraken, is going to only give up 1 to maybe 2 goals per game, and you can just win one of these pitcher duels or goalie duels. And it is an approach that, as we saw specifically with those Islanders, whether it was with Lambert as the assistant head coach under Trotz or as the head coach himself, can find you that consistent regular season success, at least in getting to the playoffs and being that perennial playoff team, like the Kraken have said from ownership on down that they want to be as soon as possible, but does have a tendency to fall apart in the playoffs, as we saw with the Islanders at one point or another, when you don't have the offense to back it up. And, well, I mean, we've seen defensively strong teams in whether it was the Lightning winning back-to-back cups and making it to a third, or the Panthers, who have now made it to their third Stanley Cup in a row, both with strong goaltending and strong defensive structures, but also both teams that had some high-end offensive talent that could strike back the other way and really take advantage offensively when the game was presenting itself to them in that way, which is something that the Islanders, well, it's why they never got past the Eastern Conference Final and were beaten by that Lightning team 2 years in a row. Either way, again, a system that can consistently get you to the playoffs if executed well, but has a hard time keeping up with some of the more well-rounded and superstar offensively laden teams once you get especially deeper into a playoff run. Now for the Kraken, I think all they really care about at this point is trying to get to the playoffs or being competitive towards the end of the season. And eventually, once you start to get some of these younger players like Matty Beniers, or especially more of the offensive upside players like hopefully Shane Wright or Berkeley Catton, maybe some of the other guys they have in the pipeline, or maybe some players that you add via trade or free agency in the next few years. You're hoping to just kind of start to instill that culture of success and then build around it as those young players start to get more into their prime. So with that being said, while that does seem pretty clearly to be the plan from the Kraken at the moment, is that last part in the future of these young players that the Kraken have, the young core that they're waiting until they get into their prime, the Matty Beniers, the Shane Wright, Berkeley Catton, whoever they end up getting 8th overall in this next draft. It's their future that is kind of the spot of all this that gives me, I wouldn't necessarily say worry, but the most pause, the most potential for long-term downside. This is very clearly a head coaching move made by the Kraken. I mean, they said as much when they pointed out that they're not looking for a guy with no NHL experience. They weren't looking to take the chance on a first-time head coach. They were very much looking for the head coach that they felt they could get would give them the best chance of making the playoffs as quickly as possible, with that being the primary goal, and whatever happens in the future being, well, they're still trying to maximize the future potential. Very much this is a franchise thinking about the here and now more so than the future, and with the current structure of the team, a veteran core that, while decent, doesn't have a ton of upside and isn't ready to on its own carry a team, but a young core that isn't ready to do that themselves. So you're kind of caught in the middle, and they're kind of more in a spot where you should probably be thinking a little bit more about the future. And again, even though I do think that this roster, even as it's currently constructed under the Lambert system, and I do still expect a couple of relatively big changes coming for the Kraken roster-wise as we get through the rest of this offseason. They still have a couple of free agent signings to make that we're expecting for Riker Evans and also likely Capo Caco. But aside from all of that, even if they didn't make any changes and we took this exact same roster that we finished the season with, and Mahura has already been re-signed for 2 more years and went into next year with the same roster, I do think that they could make the playoffs if they really buy into the Lambert system and played as well as the Islanders did for a few years there. This is a team that, yeah, sure, could overcome the odds and make the playoffs under that system executed well. It's still not a system that with the current roster is going to get you particularly deep into the playoffs once you're there. Now, maybe that's not something that the front office really cares about, but it's what you're giving up to get there that could be a problem for the Kraken long term. This very much looks like a decision that was made for the short term success of the team and just hoping that things work out long term, because what you could be giving up in the long term is some of that potential of your younger players, specifically on the offensive end. Now, as we know, we already kind of mentioned with Matty Beniers, the defensive end is much more his strength, and this type of system would, at least on paper, theoretically, lean into his strengths. And while it might not develop the offensive side of the game for him that much, it seems very possible, though it's still early on, so too early to tell for sure, but very possible that the offensive side of Beniers' game is not really going to be where he adds his significant value to the team. That much more likely is going to be on the defensive end, and this is the type of system that he could continue to grow that strength that he already has under. But to the rest of the team, specifically the rest of the young players, not just already on the team, but coming up through the system, that a Lambert-style system that looks to suffocate offense, specifically it's looking to suffocate the offense of the opponent, but also can kind of serve to suffocate your own offense in exchange for playing better defensively. That could have an impact on stunting the growth or even limiting the ceiling, offensive ceiling and growth of some of your other prospects coming up, like Shane Wright, for example, who did start to see some offensive growth towards the end of last season and still was figuring out the defensive end, and that probably would get better under a Lambert system, but the offensive growth could be stunted potentially under a system that really doesn't favor the offensive end. Now, for Shane Wright in particular, if it is a system that does lean on specifically the center, but forwards getting to the net front and having the shots come from the defenseman up by the blue line and stressing net front or the high danger, presence from the offense around the net, that is a style of game that Shane Wright in particular specifically does lend to the way that he likes to play the game, especially as we saw towards the end of the season where he got a lot of his goals. So maybe he specifically does find some offensive ways to break out and grow under a system like this one. Then as we start to look deeper into the Kraken system and some of the other prospects coming up, specifically Berkeley Catton, who is smaller than Wright. And I mean, we already talked about this being a Kraken offensive core that even with the more veteran players is not particularly on the bigger end, and both Beniers and Wright are not particularly on the bigger end. Both of them are kind of one of the things they need to work on is putting on a little bit of weight, which is generally true of most prospects, but they're not particularly bigger guys. Berkeley Catton is not only not a bigger guy, he's specifically on the smaller end. So the whole net front game is not likely to be a huge part of his game. He is much more a fast, open ice, using creativity and speed to create offensive opportunities. And a system like this one just doesn't really lend itself to that type of game. Now, again, maybe there's ways that they find a way to work that out, but this is very much a short term. This roster can win playing this way. So we hope that they can just figure out the offense. But I think there's reason to worry about what it could do to the offensive ceiling of some of these younger players, specifically in a Shane Wright or Berkeley Catton. I mean, who knows what they're going to get at 8th overall, whether it's defenseman or another forward in this upcoming draft. But I mean, if you look at if you were to make it up to the NHL level, a Jagger Furcus, for example, some of these other offensively talented Kraken forwards that are coming up in the system and coming up pretty quickly, faster than I think the Kraken would have expected, that offensive, creative, fast game that they had been playing for a couple years at the AHL level under Bielsma and then even this last season, that game is just not going to translate very well into this much more rigid defense forward, not necessarily looking to constantly create these fast-paced offensive plays. It's just, yeah. I might be rambling a little bit, but I think you get my point. There's concern here that it could stunt the offensive growth and ceiling of some of these younger players long term. And so then if you're in a spot where you're hoping to get a couple rounds deep for a couple of seasons and potentially sacrifice the long-term success, is it really worth it to sacrifice long-term ceiling for a higher short-term floor that really is not going to be a cup contending floor? I think there's an argument to be made that the Kraken maybe should be leaning a little bit more on just let these next couple seasons be what they are and set up for really trying to maximize your ceiling in 4-5 years when Beniers, Wright, and Catton are starting to get a little bit more into their prime. But that is thinking long into the future. At that point, who knows? Maybe Lambert won't even be the coach. Heck, at the rate that we've gone these last couple of seasons, he might not even be the coach this time next year. So we'll have to wait and see. But as always, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments section below about this hiring. Again, as far as I'm concerned, it's not one that I really have strong feelings about at this point, one way or the other. I see the potential upside, certainly in the short term of it. It, as of right now, is probably one of the better moves the Kraken could have made based on who was available to try to have as much success this next season as they possibly could. What that means for the long term, we'll have to wait and see, but again, there's no guarantee that Lambert will be around for the long term anyway. Oh, and I suppose one other thing that's certainly worth mentioning here towards the end, especially since we just spent all that, even if it was a bit rambly, time talking about the progression of the younger players and the development of those younger players as we look more towards the long term beyond just what this move means for the short term. As far as the looking towards the long term, I think that is a big part of the reason that they are keeping Jessica Campbell around as a part of this coaching staff. I mean, yeah, there certainly is the part of it that there's just no way that they could fire Jessica Campbell after 1 year. It would have looked absolutely terrible from a PR standpoint to hire the first ever female just behind the bench coach at all in the NHL and then immediately fire her the next season. So I think that was already a bit of a non-starter in the first place. But aside from that, she definitely does, one of her real strengths is the skills, especially skating skills, but also shooting skills coaching, which she was doing very well at the AHL level under Bielsma, and then continued to do that. Was one of the bigger parts of the reason she was brought up to the NHL level to continue doing that with Shane Wright, even Matty Beniers, though he wasn't at the AHL level ever, but also Riker Evans, Ty Cartier to some extent as well. She is, I think, a large part of this team's hedging towards the future part of things. Again, one last time, just to be clear, my concerns about the future of the Kraken and the development of the prospect pool and young players is not so much to do with Lambert specifically and how he'll handle the younger players, which could have been a concern under some of the other coaches that the Kraken could have hired. It's much more just to do with the system that Lambert likes to play at the NHL level, and a little bit to do with the clear mentality from the ownership on down that they're very much at this point interested in short-term success, and that sometimes can come at the cost of not thinking about the long term quite as much. But again, I digress. I'll stop rambling for now. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below about this hiring, if somehow it's one that you saw coming, or if there's some other coaches out there that you would have liked to see instead, or just where you're at if you have any strong feelings. Let me know down in the comment section below, and until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.